TE Talks with Guides is a weekly podcast for lovers of history, travel, and all things Italian. Welcome back, everybody, to TE Talks, sponsored by Through Eternity Tours. I'm your host, Rob Allen, and on TE Talks, we get to talk with some of the most fascinating people who make a living out of being wonderful storytellers. We get to delve into what drives their passion, what new things they're learning, and what they love to tell us. Today, we are having Thomas back again. Ciao, Thomas. How are you?
Pretty good, Rob. How are you doing?
Very, very good, Thomas.
Yeah. It's morning.
I'm going to try to be a bit more subdued because I was so enthusiastic on my talk with Grace in the last podcast that there was this reverb. It sounded like I was shouting the entire time. I was acting like I do with my YouTube videos. So that's why I have this tone. Maybe I have my radio voice on. Who knows? Anyway, Thomas, so today we are going to delve into the argument, as the Italians like to say, of some beautiful churches outside the walls to accompany our YouTube channel, TE Destinations, outside the walls of Rome. First of all, I love to say that Rome has walls. I don't think a lot of tourists realize that, do they?
Yeah, and they're not medieval walls. They're ancient walls built by an emperor in the late 3rd century. 19-kilometer circuit. Most of it's still there.
Exactly. I love the walls. I have a dream that I will one day walk the walls on my own, just to walk around the walls.
I want to live in the walls. I used to live in the neighborhood of San Lorenzo, and there are several homes, literally, not against the walls, but inside actually in the structure of the walls. And you walk by and, they've got their windows open and their TV blaring and smells of cooking pasta sauce coming out of the window. I want to live in the walls.
So, oh yeah, of course, you're right. I was just thinking, I was like, where are the walls in San Lorenzo? But then, of course, it's like to get to San Lorenzo, right, which is right outside the walls. You have to go through the walls. And there's like a villa that's connected to Felici Paretti, Sixtus V, somehow. I guess that was one of it. Maybe it was a suburban villa that's totally being lived in. And you're right. You do see those people living within the walls. They have a great museum about the walls, too, at Porto San Sebastiano. Yeah, exactly. We even tried to go to something that's supposed to accompany it at the Porto Ostiense, but it was still closed when Grayson and I and Dylan went to do the Ostia Antica video.
I've been there before. It's pretty good. It's basically, that's the little museum of the Via Ostiense, of the Ostian way, and it's kind of cool. But the one that's at Porto San Sebastiano, I think, is more.
Oh yeah, because you get
really interesting. Yeah,
get to walk in the walls. Absolutely. So, just to kind of clarify for people, we're talking about this 2 areas in specific, and they're not that far away from the Through Eternity office, which is in Piazza Bologna. But these 2 churches, we are talking about specifically Saint Agnes outside the walls and Saint Lawrence outside the walls. And I guess we want to let people understand that when these churches were built centuries ago, these were churches in the countryside, really, not in the middle of the urban sprawl of the city of Rome. So could you tell us a little about that? And then I want to get involved with the circus form churches just a little bit to tell people about it.
There are a couple of different reasons. One is one that we kind of have to assume, well, whether we have to or not, we do assume that Constantine may have been a Christian. And I have to be careful. People think, oh no, Constantine didn't become a Christian until he was on his deathbed. I'm not going to get into all of that argument. What I'm interested in is where he spent his money, and where he spent his money was on the Christian church, promoting it, pushing it, encouraging it, helping it, and building a lot of churches. And I'll let whatever's on the other side of eternity deal with the state of his soul. But we're far more interested, at least for the purposes of this conversation, where was he showing his money? And he was showing his money here. However, the vast majority of the population of the city of Rome was not Christian.
Hmm.
The estimates range pretty widely, but I think a fairly conservative estimate at the time of Constantine's legalization of Christianity in the year 313, the Christian population of Rome. I mean, I've seen estimates that run up to 12%. Personally, I think that's a little high.
Wow.
But again, if 12% is kind of high. Now there are other parts of the empire, other cities that did have much higher percentages of Christian residents, not the city of Rome. So, yes, he's promoting this thing, but you're not outlawing everything else. There's still all the traditional religions of Rome, all
Sure.
the Roman gods, along with the Egyptian ones and the Persian ones. I mean, we're getting them from all over the place. So all the gods are real, for the way these guys were thinking of such things.
Hmm.
Um, uh, so Constantine is promoting this and lifting it up. But even when he sets up the residence for the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, he does it inside the walls, but barely inside the walls, and in an area of town that was not heavily urbanized anyway, an area within the walls that was not heavily urbanized.
Hmm.
And that's St. John in Lateran. And so part of this was, yes, he's promoting it, but he's not trying to displace, he's not trying to unnecessarily annoy or disrupt or bother everyone else. So these Christian places that are noticeably Christian, evidently Christian, big places deliberately built to be places of Christian worship, public Christian worship, are none of them are in the center of the center. They're all on the outskirts. The other reason for that is a lot of early Christian spaces were marking where something happened, where a saint or a martyr had lived or performed a miracle or died or was buried. And San Lorenzo is a great example of that. St. Lawrence, homeboy, and he's martyred here in Rome.
Hmm.
On where he is said to have lived, there is a church called St. Lawrence in Rome. Where he is said to have performed a miracle, there is a church called St. Lawrence in Rome. Where he was martyred, there is a church called St. Lawrence in Rome. And where he is entombed, there is a church called St. Lawrence in Rome. So marking where something happened. Now, as this kind of develops, and you do get churches cropping up within the urban fabric, and these were the old domus ecclesia, the old house churches, where wealthy people were using or allowing their homes to be used as meeting places for Christians, even before Christianity was legal. Well, then those places kind of get converted into churches. A great example there is Santa Sabina on the Aventine Hill. Also, San Lorenzo in Lucina, right
Santa
smack
Susana, right?
in
Also,
the middle of the city. Santa Susana as well. Yeah. So, and these are closer in, and that happens a little bit later on, often anyway, in the 5th century, sometimes in the very, very late 4th. But these earliest, these Constantinian and immediately succeeding Constantine churches are out in the, and certainly the ones that we're going to be talking about, which were funerary basilicas, were by law outside the city, not because churches had to be outside the gates, but because you got to deal with your dead outside the city gates.
yes.
You have cities of the living, cities of the dead. It's okay for the living to visit the dead. You do not want the dead visiting the living. One of the many reasons they keep them separated. And those ancient pre-Christian or non-Christian places were called necropolis, which literally means city of the dead.
Yeah.
And so when wealthy Christian people begin to allow some of their suburban or ex-urban space, land, to be used as, well, basically burial ground for Christians, those are what become the catacombs, and they're all outside of the city gates.
Sure. This is a wonderful way to put it, and just to put into a context for people, because we can't just assume everyone knows about Constantine. Every tour guide knows about Constantine like the back of our hands. Well, somewhat. Is that it's the beginning of the 300s, so the beginning of the 4th century AD, of course, when he legalizes Christianity. I never thought about it, though, of it being 12%, but that's fascinating. Probably then to assume, then we're talking about that the eastern part of the empire, starting from Judea onwards, is more Christianized when Rome is at 12%. Of course, later on, much more of it was.
Rome is such a big city, for one.
Sure.
But even a little later on, Alexandria a much higher percentage of Christian population than Rome did around the time of Constantine's so-called conversion.
Yeah.
Other cities as well. You follow. It's not just Paul, but you follow the missionary voyages of Paul all over the Mediterranean world. And he's one of lots of people who are going out, spreading the word, establishing communities, and that message growing. But yeah, in the eastern part of the empire, there were places across North Africa, across what we would think of as Western Turkey, and then up the Mediterranean coast, Syria, for example, where you had large, powerful, wealthy cities with big populations, with much higher than 12%. Rome is, and then certainly because the Senate is here, and they are the great the docents of tradition, and that upper class kind of resists for quite a long time. They are the ones protecting Roman identity and Roman gods and all of those traditions. By definition, it is a conserving institution, conservative institution, and Christianity is the newfangled thing coming in and horning in on their turf, which at least gives a perception of threatening identity. And all of a sudden we're into conversations that sound a lot like this morning's newspaper.
Yes, I can. Well, every morning newspaper for the last tons of years, but absolutely. Let's just to clarify another thing I wanted to say for people, because sometimes I'm always shocked when you have clients who say, I'm not interested in seeing churches. I don't know if people can understand what value they have. It's not as if we as guides are religious people by any means, but we do have a great appreciation for history and the faith or whatever. But I mean, it's to understand some of these churches, or to understand the churches and what went on with the history of the churches, to understand the city of Rome itself, and that there are these wonderful jewels of history on so many different levels. And in particular, I think that these two churches that we see today of Saint Agnes outside the walls and Saint Lawrence are stunningly beautiful. I mean, they transport you to a different time period. And thank you for doing such a wonderful job of setting up the structure, because they are obliged, when these churches are being built, they are funerary churches, as you clarified, the first versions that they had. And they had to follow the Roman law, which meant that they had to bury their dead outside the city walls, because that was the place for the dead anyway. Even for the ancient Romans, like you go on the consular roads, they were covered in funerary monuments, tombs, etc. So to talk about them, and let's start with St. Lawrence, I'm such a stickler about this, and I want to talk to Luca in further detail about them, because I remember when we were studying as guides, we had to kind of go over and learn everything. And then all of a sudden, like, oh, and don't forget, you have to learn the circus form churches. I was like, circus form churches? What are you talking about? And then I started to get very fascinated by them. I think that there are 6, and only one in Rome still has that form, although it's been heavily adapted, but the structure is there, and that's St. Sebastian outside the walls. And then at St. Agnes outside the walls, you can even see the walls, and something very important that we'll get into a little bit later that is connected to it that you can see. But the one at St. Lawrence is gone. I know more or less where it is. It's kind of... Yeah,
you can see that at St. Agnes, you can see the whole form.
Yes.
The outline of it. A lot of that structure. St. Lawrence, no. But the Verano Cemetery, the monumental cemetery, the first great public cemetery, monumental cemetery of
beautiful
Rome, is built on top of it.
Yep.
It just built right on top of it.
Yeah,
that used to be.
We're going to do filming inside of that too. Guys, if you want to see beautiful cemeteries, I mean, New Orleans, which is one of the cities that I love most in the world, they were still promoting these tours, like, oh, look at our funerary voodoo cemetery tours. And I was like, meh. Because when you go to the cemetery inside the walls, the Cattolico, Protestant cemetery, and this one,
Yeah.
These cemeteries are gorgeous. They're just so beautiful. Dylan and I often for exercise and would be walking through that cemetery. But to get back on track, so we have these circus form churches that are built specifically to be in the shape of a circus. Why is that, you would say?
And they're typically not built on top of the saint they're supposed to be in honor of, but rather adjacent to, kind of, near the catacombs, where that particular, often, the catacombs of Saint Agnes, or the catacombs. These were just, for the most part, many were necropoli, where people were stuck along with everybody else, such is the case with Peter and Paul.
Yep.
Then, when you're talking about, 3rd century saints, then we do have existing catacomb structures, which are different. They're sort of burial space deliberately made to be underground. Like you dig a hole in the ground and you got little shells on the wall of that hole, and then you got lots of tunnels spinning around like an intestinal tract underneath the ground. So when they put, just using Saint Agnes as an example, they weren't called the catacombs of Saint Agnes. Later on, she kind of is the star of the show. She's the most popular, most venerated of the many people who were there. So they end up being known as the catacombs of Saint Agnes. Either way, when Constantine is building these big churches, not building them on top of those catacombs, but rather adjacent to, near, in this case of St. Lawrence, very, very near. But and the idea was, in fact, the one at St. Lawrence there's a lot of discussion about exactly how this works. In fact, some believe that it was open, where you basically have a covered walkway around the perimeter that looks like Piazza Navona. It looks like a racetrack. So it's kind of flat on one end and rounded at the other, and like a big cigar. And there was just a covered walkway all the way around that, but open in the middle. Some were open, some were closed, some were not sure. And were they really used as churches within which to have a mass? In fact, there's quite a bit of doubt about some of this stuff now. And different ones may have different situations. Like there is a small little prayer chapel right on top of where Lawrence was located within those catacombs. Or was it a church? We'll come back to the same thing we were talking about in St. Agnes, because it's a lot of the same questions. Was it just a little prayer chapel? Was it a proper church? Where were they meeting?
Often, or covered cemeteries, I think they were referred to.
Yeah, right. So, and especially with these, whether they were covered or not, these big sort of cigar-shaped spaces were for the gathering of masses of throngs of people, pilgrims. It was about pilgrims, about people coming to honor what it is that in Lawrence or Agnes or whatever, what they represent, and their lives, their sacrifice, their martyrdom, their holiness, etc. And it was a way of, this is a very Mediterranean concept of ancient space. Proximity confers a certain number of benefits. The closer you are, the more sacrifice that you go to arrive at that place. You've traveled from far away. And some of this kind of lingers with, the Camino of San Juan de Compostela, for example. You got to schlep. Sure, you could drive there, but that's not really the point, is it? It's you walk, you take that, and it's contemplative, and it stresses your body out, and it opens your mind, and all of those things are part of this experience. So when you finally arrive in Rome and you're visiting the tombs of these saints and martyrs, you have abnegated the physicality of yourself in the way that their physicality was sacrificed. And you plug in, and prayers are heard better, miracles happen. That's the idea. And so those spaces were just for accommodating enormous throngs of people, of worshipers, pilgrims.
Yeah, it's amazing. So we do have these spaces, and then, I mean, they were developed later on, and then eventually they even started to have these wonderful funerary monuments attached to them. And then other churches started to do this, like St. Peter's. I love those two circular mausoleums that were attached to St. Peter's that I talk about in my podcast with Federica. But yeah, so we have circular mausoleums that are attached to these circus form covered cemeteries, whatever you have. But then after a certain point, as you said, then they started to build really above the saints of Lawrence and Agnes. So let's talk about specifically then the history of the building that we can see today of St. Lawrence, which is quite amazing. I mean,
it's a mashup.
Yeah, it is a mashup, but it's gorgeous. It's a gorgeous church.
It's one building that's existed since the late 500s, which apparently replaces this earlier oratory. I say oratory, which means prayer chapel. Because if you've ever been to a Latin mass, oremus, let us pray. The Latin verb for to pray is orar. So an oratory is a prayer chapel. Well, that gets replaced with a proper church, and a fairly large one. Then significantly later on, so what are we talking? 13th century. Then that gets replaced, sort of. It really just gets added to. What we do is that this huge long stretch is in the 1290s, and there's a lot of discussion as to exactly why this particular church, and it coincides anyway with the appointment of one particular guy as the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem. These are the Crusader kingdoms, and quite interesting in that's happening in the early 1200s. The Crusader kingdom falls in the late 1200s. Well, as they kind of make their peregrinations around, that Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem can't live in Jerusalem anymore. He ends up in this church, St. Lawrence, outside the walls, becomes the home of the guy who says, yes, I am the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, even though he's not there anymore. So it seems to correspond at the same time, the early 1200s, the appointment of this particular guy as Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem. This is a political move. It's diplomacy as much as anything else, seems to be rendering homage to that. And what this Pope does, Honorius III, is build onto the back of that church from the late 500s.
Sure.
So you had, there's the door, then you come in and there's a church. But the back of the church adds this whole great big long hall, and then reverse it, puts the door on the other end of that hall. So the door is now on the complete opposite end.
Yep.
And that old church then, the one that had been there since the late 500s, becomes basically the presbytery. The presbytery is the area of the altar. And it's on a different level. It's much higher than the rest of the church that Honorius III builds on the back of that. So, and it's not even at a right angle because, hey, this is the topography we got. So it's not even perfectly lined up. Clearly not something that was all that important to them. But you walk into this church, it one of several places in Rome where you really do walk in and you're completely transported, back pushing 1,000 years, and feels like it. And there very rarely are there actually people in it. And then it's got a cloisters because it's still a working monastery.
Yes,
it's got a cosmatesque cloisters for their monastery, and cosmatesque going back to the same time as the building of this new church, the early 1200s, and those rather identifiable designs, so closely associated with Rome, sort of interwinding serpentine geometric forms made most especially with white and yellow marbles, and then green serpentines and red porphyries. I mean, spectacular stuff.
Oh God, yeah, no, it's just like I love it because a lot of the kind of cosmatesque floors that you can see in the other churches of Rome, they're kind of newish or have redone, but there you do get a total sense that is the original floor, the Ambrose on the side, meaning the pulpits. I mean, it's just lock, stock, and barrel. And just to let people know, it from 1300 onwards, it later on was so important. It's been a very, very important church that it became one of the 7 churches that you needed to go to on a pilgrimage when you came to Rome during the Holy Year.
Yep. To get your plenary indulgence. Yes,
to get your plenary indulgence. I think what the church is used a lot today still, it's used because of funerals. It's right next to the cemetery, which is dating back to the 19th century, if I'm not mistaken. It's really the 1800s that they built that cemetery up.
Yeah, later 1800s. Yep.
Yep. But I mean, it's been associated with that, and it's become this kind of giant funerary church again. So that's what happens a lot. You have very important individuals or whomever, but often, if I walk by or I bike there, you can see the funerals going on. But it is just a gorgeous church. And when you enter in, and as you explained, I think in the space itself, you are completely transported, but it's unique because of the fact that we have these two churches that have been combined. Real difficult to study and understand. That's why I always love to read about the things that we had to learn and then go and see it, because it's almost like the old church it creates where the high altar is. It creates a raised platform because they have the tomb of Lawrence below it, but then you have to go upstairs to get up to that level of where the older church is in the back. And so it's beautiful double open space, and it happens to be along with Saint Agnes outside the walls to have, and they're very rare to be in these churches, but they're the madrone, so it's like that part of the church in the back where the high altar is, that you see that there were these two levels that are unique. Sometimes they were supposedly for women to go up in the top level, but then sometimes it was also to deal with a different entryway into the churches. And I think both Saint Agnes.
Certainly that's true at Saint Agnes. It's certainly true.
Yeah.
Or sometimes you have like, at Saint Agnes, the nuns there are still cloistered. Mm-hmm. So traditionally, when you're having a mass that's open to all the people, well, they don't mix with the people. They stay up, in the old, basically matronium, something that functions in much the same way, kind of a separation. Mm-hmm. And by the way, St. Lawrence isn't the only famous guy down in the crypt of that church either. Of course, you got 5 different popes. The most recent one is Pius IX from the end of the 19th century. So yeah, he is the end of the 19th century.
That's right. He's buried in that
I think
church.
I misspoke.
I forgot about that.
I think I said that when you were talking about the Verano, I said late 19th century. It's Napoleonic, so it's early 19th century. But anyway, there's also St. Stephen, the proto-martyr, they call him. The guy that appears in the Acts of the Apostles, where Paul was one of the guys standing by watching as this guy was getting stoned and feeling very self-satisfied because he thought that was a good idea to stone Stephen or Stephen, depending on how you want to pronounce it.
Well, Stephen.
But he's brought. So in the early 400s, some priest says, I had a dream, and it was revealed to me in a dream where Stephen's body is. They dig him up, and he gets brought to a church, Hagia Sion, which is on Mount Zion, in right around in what's now Israel, and ends up making a few peregrinations. Ends up finally being brought to Rome when the church was built. By Pelagius II in the late 500s. His body then is brought to Rome to sit alongside Lawrence. And the story is that Lawrence's bones rather politely, miraculously just moved to one side to make a little more room for Stephen. They're great stories. I love this stuff.
Of course, because the importance, it can, these places, it's lovely in this context, this venue that we have in the podcast, because we can just dedicate ourselves chatting about these two things. And even then, even 50 minutes is not enough time. But when you're giving a tour, you really don't have the luxury of telling that. You can do a little sound bite of it. But, this idea of transporting and acquiring these relics of saints was really important. That's why, what did Venice go through to get the bones of Saint Mark? They wrapped it with theft and wrapped it in
subterfuge.
Port, so that they would that the Muslims wouldn't want to be interested in what was in their containers. It's just incredible. I did not remember that his bones were there, and I don't know if a lot of people know, but classically, specifically also in the Renaissance, right? In the chapel of Nicholas V, if I'm not mistaken, we have Beato Angelico, who's done, and they are classically depicted together, the lives of St. Lawrence and St. Stephen. They're connected together when they're being depicted. And so we have them here, beautiful in this church. And the church has stunning mosaics. stunning mosaics over the triumphal arch of the high altar, more or less like where the two churches combine. And then it even has, if you're allowed, because they're not letting people go up the steps anymore recently, the controfocciata, the counter facade, which I always love this term. And so it's right on the other side. So you would have seen it as if it were in the context of the old church. Right. And the columns are another lovely Italian word, the spoglia, the spoils, which means really, the spoils
recycled
of war. Recycled, beautiful, gorgeous, ancient columns. And it's amazing to think of how well preserved the church is. Yeah.
Although you've got the smithereens bombed out of it by the Allies.
I was just about to say that too, because before we go into the Church of Saint Agnes, we do have to mention, and there's some very powerful images of that. Also, that Pius IX was buried there. I forgot, and people don't know a lot about him, but he had the longest reign of any pope, and he was going through very controversial, big changes in the history of Rome itself and the Industrial Revolution. And some people love Pius IX. A lot of people didn't really like him. But then we have another controversial pope involved with this, because during the Second World War, the Allies, let's just be clear, it's really the U.S. soldiers, they were bombing Rome for its infrastructure, as one does. And so they were bombing the trains, the train tracks, etc. In fact, my neighborhood...
Tiburtina Station's very close.
Yeah, exactly. Also, my area, Pineto, was badly damaged, and they messed up. They bombed this church. They destroyed the facade of the church. And there's a very powerful photograph of Pius XII, who was the Pope at the time during the Second World War. He comes to see the damage, and because
before it was even really safe.
Yeah, before it was safe. And there's such a powerful image because you see the people surrounding him, and he has his arms like spread out wide to like get connected to the people. I mean, people, I think oftentimes they don't realize that for many people, the Pope is somebody he is the bridge to God for them. He is the connector in the Catholic faith. He's the guy who's supposed to be communicating up to God. I mean, whatever it means, these people, in this terrifying time, are reaching out to him, and he's participating in this. And the fact is that also, we didn't even talk about in the portico. They've done an incredible job. Yeah. It looks perfect. You could not tell that the roof and the entire ceiling was destroyed and the facade was destroyed.
They reused as much of the original material as they could, and then added to it. But they did it in such a way that you almost can't tell. They did a really good job putting it back together.
Yep, exactly. So, going there for a morning or an afternoon is just truly worthwhile if you have a great interest in historical churches, you love those mosaics, and you want to be changed and brought back to time. And then, of course, even the cemetery itself is gorgeous.
And then have lunch in the neighborhood that is named after San Lorenzo.
Yep.
It's a little rough around the edges. It's just outside the walls, so between the walls and the massive university complex. It's full of students and interesting people living very alternative lives. It's
very
full of absolutely amazing graffiti. First of all, they take great pride in the graffiti in the neighborhood.
Yep.
And some of the best eaten in town.
Oh yeah, I'm going to have to, because we're going to be filming and reshooting some of the scenes around it. We're going to take Mario along, so I got to ask you some good places that you would recommend in San Lorenzo.
La Mucca Bischera, I love that place.
Okay,
it's the sly cow.
You're a sly cow,
but it's fantastic grill, first of all, and then the traditional Roman piatti, the dishes. That they just do right.
Of course.
Anyway, we'll talk more about that later.
Listen, so to go on from there, talking about mosaics and amazing buildings that no one ever goes to, everyone lines up to see some of the most famous pieces of Rome. But I mean, that's the other thing, is like these pieces are just as valuable, just as important, and should be just as famous. But people kind of on an average spend 3 days in Rome. But going to the Church of Saint Agnes outside the walls, which is
Yeah.
not that far away
No.
on the
In
Via
the
Nomentana.
Nomentana.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about that church and then get into the details of what people can see at this church.
Well, you have they call it the monumental complex
Mm.
of St. Agnes outside the walls. You have the catacombs that are called the catacombs of St. Agnes, 3rd century. You have the Constantinian circus form basilica, the outline of that still there. You have the mausoleum of Costanza,
Yes.
or Constantina, as we usually say in English, which you made a very oblique reference to before, and then what's called the Honorian Basilica, because it was built by Pope Honorius I in the early 600s.
Mm.
So you've got these several different structures. They're all part of this complex in what is called the African Quarter here, because it's all named after cities and areas of northeastern Africa in Libya, Ethiopia, Eritrea, where Italy had their effort at
The fascists, you
imperialism.
mean, during the Second World War? Yes.
Oh yeah, but it finishes with that, but it starts much earlier than that.
Sure.
Italian presence in Libya and Ethiopia.
Ethiopia, yep. Mm-hmm.
So these the street names are all names of those cities, areas within Italian Northeast Africa. That's why it's called the African Quarter. And it's a new part of the city, relatively speaking. And it was built to be a fairly well-to-do area. It still is fairly high rent area. Then you get this complex, though, and it's all walled in. You walk around in there, you'd swear you're out in the country somewhere. It's green, it's lush, but it's also a very, very active parish where families go. Then they've got a youth center and basketball courts in the middle of all of this. So it's a real strange mix, and a mix of ancient in the middle of a relatively new modern neighborhood with kids playing in an active youth center and ancient mausolea, and it's a real someone described it to me. It's so schizophrenic here, but
that's a lot of Rome's kind of like that, though.
Well, exactly, because that doesn't feel odd to me at all, because that's our daily experience, which of course is one of the cool things about Rome, is it's still where it's always been. And I walk down a block and there's an old late ancient dining hall, or what's left of it. You just kind of have to walk around it to get to the restaurant. 5-minute walk, I'm in the Parco della Gaffarella, this massive nature reserve around the ancient Appian Way, and walking around, and there's fields and streams and hills and sheep, and a big chunk of an old aqueduct, an ancient aqueduct, and an infeum. This area that had fountains. It was a special, fabulous picnic place, a private picnic place for a very wealthy aristocratic family in antiquity. And I mean, that's where I go to get some exercise every day. And it's a 5-minute walk from my flat. So that's all perfectly normal for me. But coming from the outside, it would seem a little bit schizophrenic because there's so much going on, but yet it's quiet, it's removed, and walking around some of these spaces, especially because they're all old, where the oldest stuff are the catacombs, which you can still visit. And then, the new, besides the basketball court, is the 7th century church. So you get a stretch across time in various ways that Rome has expressed its devotion to Saint Agnes and its faith in that higher spiritual power and our eternal identity, such as the idea.
Just to be like an interesting sidebar, which I was in the Parco della Caffarella, an experience, because I know it pretty well too. I mean, if you live around, it's huge, and you kind of go around for walks in it, and it's a completely protected. Fortunately for us, from the urban sprawl, you just see the buildings built directly with it. They all have spectacular views inside the park. I was there with a friend once right around Easter, and you could see a herd of sheep, and there was the shepherd walking behind, and I thought he was holding a newborn in his arm, like he was like dangling from the back legs of this lamb, and I thought it was dead because it was not looking as if it was moving, and then all of a sudden it started to move, this poor little lamb, and I was like, oh my God, it was just born. It was immediately, because the mother was following directly after,
Yeah.
trying to see what was going on. It was such a different kind of moment in time, and to see that, and to see that structure and that like kind of birth and stuff, and then you kind of go into and you think, okay, this is this innocence, I guess, or sacrifice. I don't know. It was just kind of interesting, because for many people, they don't realize that Christ wasn't always worshipped as a figure on a cross,
Right.
which was a symbol of capital punishment. Now, that's kind of controversial for some people to hear, but you do have Christian archaeologists who confirm this for you, that it was he was the young shepherd with the lamb on his shoulders,
Yeah.
and Saint Agnus Dei, which is right, the Lamb of God, and she has a very big important thing with the sheep, and that's connected into the church. So let's talk about some of the beautiful things inside this complex. Again, it's another one, and also Saint Lawrence, by the way, he doesn't have the catacombs in his name. I keep on forgetting. It's like Syriac, I guess, is the name of the
Simaco.
Simaco. Yes. Okay. So there are the catacombs of Simaco, as you did say that there were catacombs there. So those I've never been able to see. But St. Agnes is one of the ones that is not as popularly packed with tourists. But you have the catacombs. It's like you get through the complex, you go to the right to the church itself. It's like you have to walk down this monumental staircase, and of course both of these places then, from excavations of these catacombs, will have, like in St. Lawrence, there's the courtyard that has all the pieces of the grave coverings, not all of them, but many pieces with Latin inscriptions. And the same thing here when you're going down this staircase to get to the main church.
Yeah, because it's built following the topography.
Yeah.
So the traditional entrance into St. Agnes, that stairway was added in what, the 17th or 18th century, I think.
Yeah.
And then when they basically open up, removing all the dirt against the end of the church, where you have a door now, but that's pretty modern. That's the 19th century, I think.
Mm-hmm.
The traditional entrance to the Church of St. Agnes is from Via Nomentana, the big,
to the Madrone.
Nomentana way that runs what we now think of as behind the church. So and it doesn't look very high. The church doesn't look very high from the street. But standing there, you can look down now a modern street where all the dirt has been removed, and you got a modern road that runs down there. But you see old woodcuts of this. You had, like you were talking about before, chapels that are built, private chapels that are built right up against the outside of the church, kind of in a row. So what families would do is purchase the right to knock down a part of the exterior wall and build their chapel, boom, right up against it. You had a whole line of those. You see old woodcuts, and you still see those out there like that. Coming in from the street, you walk in what seems the area of the apse, that rounded space that houses the altar, for example. But you would walk in that door, and in fact, you realize you're on an upper balcony. So you walk in, and you're actually looking down into the church. And a lot of this is believed, anyway, that there was one way of accommodating the crowds, because people would come in. You'd have mass services taking place inside the church, and these people could kind of come in and circle around without disrupting the mass. And you see this in a different way in massive, for example, Gothic cathedrals. Notre Dame in Paris comes to mind immediately, where you walk in, imagine a mass taking place at the altar. Well, you can go down the extreme right or left side aisles and walk around, and you have what's called a word went right out of my head. It literally
ambulatory.
Means, yeah, exactly, perambulatory, which literally means walk around. So which runs behind the altar, where there's a kind of wall. So you could walk around this perambulatory on the side aisles, up behind the altar, say your prayers, drop your money, light your candles, whatever, and then turn around and head back out without ever disrupting the mass. This is exactly what we think this kind of thing was doing at a church like St. Agnes, where they're coming in right off the street, coming in on this high balcony. It was a wraparound balcony.
Mm-hmm.
Now you could go down to the church as well and take part in the mass. Or if the mass weren't going on, then you could go up and around to the altar, because that altar is built right on top of the tomb of Agnes, where in this case, just like in Lawrence's, the one that Constantine had built, the big circus form one, was adjacent to, not on top of, but adjacent to.
Mm-hmm.
And then with this one, it said, and there's argument about this, was it just an oratory or was it actually a church?
Mm-hmm.
And here we get Symmachus, again, the same guy you were just talking about, who's associated here with the early 500s, restores the basilica, but it's kind of assumed now that they actually meant the church, not the Constantine one, which we reckon by that time is all but abandoned.
Yeah.
And so either way, and then in 100 years later, when Honorius the First is doing a new church there, he's still kind of incorporating, okay, Symmachus, he renovated the old church, made it nicer. I'm 100 years later, I'm going to put a whole new church here. Mm-hmm. But he remembers Symmachus by putting him up in the mosaic app. So these mosaics dating to the time of the church, the early 600s, where you see Saint Agnes with these two popes, Symmachus and Honorio. Yeah. In very, very Byzantine style. Mm-hmm. Because basically what was, simplifying, what was Christian art was Byzantine art. Mm-hmm. And this is certainly true from the 6th century. That style of art that develops in Constantinople, it defines what Christian art is. And you have variations across, but certainly at this time in Rome. And that doesn't change again until a little bit later on, until we start bumping into the period of the iconoclasm in the 8th and 9th centuries. Mm-hmm. But here we're still at that place where Byzantine art is Christian art with, again, variations. But you look at that apse, it's transcendent, really.
It is. It's absolutely beautiful. And then there's a whole ceremony that goes on with the lambs.
Yep.
Because it's so funny because Grayson knows a lot about this, and she even did a video of it, because the lambs are apparently kept in Santa Cecilia in Trastevere. And she's like, "Oh, we got to do a video about this." And Dylan and I were joking because this poor lamb is being carried on a little platform, like a litter, and carried through the church. And it seems like the poor thing's being brought to the slaughter when only they're going to be shearing the lamb, and they're taking the wool. And then the wool is brought to the church St. Agnes. This, guys, it still happens. This tradition still happens.
It's been going for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah, exactly. So they bring it to St. Agnes. They bring it close to her bones. I don't know how long they keep it there, or do they do the process, because they make them into the pallia, a pallium.
I think it's basically for the most of the time of the Quaresima, of the...
of course, during Lent, right?
Yep. And then they turn them into the
pallium.
The pallia.
Yeah, which are
for new bishops.
Cloth for the new bishops, which then in turn, once they're made there, I guess, because they're again in close proximity to Agnes, then they're brought into St. Peter's. They used to have this tradition. They removed the box during our lifetime. The box was down below. People used to think Peter's bones were in that box that's at the mosaic of Christ right into the Confessio, and it's the pallia of course, because again, remember, there's this concept, that I try to emphasize with people that when I take them around, to be near, as you said, to be near where miracles have happened, to be near these saints. It brought people in their thoughts closer to God. It had this connection, this important connection. So the Vatican still does this, and these pallia, these strips of cloth that are put on the shoulders of the bishops. So they're been close to Peter, who is the first Bishop of Rome, the Pope, and these things are then going throughout the world. So there's this ancient tradition that's still going on today. Well, I love that story. But now to kind of finish our discussion, of course, we have to talk about the mausoleum of Santa Costanza that was, and like I said, I wanted to talk to Luca about circus funeral monuments, circus churches and circular mausoleums. And this has been made into a church, and it has, again, so different in style, but some of the most incredible mosaics you could ever hope to see. So let's
Yeah.
talk a little bit about that.
Well, when Constantine starts building churches, he seems to do them principally in the form of the government buildings.
Yeah.
Basileos is a Greek word, and it was a word that was used to refer to a number of different kinds of leaders. But Basileos is the word that the Greek-speaking peoples used to refer to the Roman emperor.
Mm-hmm.
And basilica is just the Greek word for a government building at that point. So, kind of standard construction model, big aisle in the middle, aisle or two on each side, a rounded space at one end, or some, derivation therefrom.
Mm-hmm.
When Constantine legalizes Christianity with that edict in the year 313, begins building churches, he begins building them in that form, principally, but not just, because he's also building a number of these circular churches. And some have believed that it was kind of modeled on the Greek concept of the tolos. We have a few of those in Rome. In a very simple version, it's the Temple of Vesta down in the Forum, or right on the Foro Boario, right on the banks of the river, near the church that has the famous, the mouth of truth.
Mm-hmm.
You have the Temple of Hercules. These are based on the Greek temple concept of a tolos, which is just it's a different kind of construction form. And so Constantine is doing a couple of each kind.
Mm-hmm.
There are a few, like the church where Mario got married, for example.
Theodora.
Exactly. San Teodoro is one of those near the Forum as well. Another one of those ancient round.
I talked to Mario about that on the podcast.
Churches. There's Santo Stefano Rotondo,
Certo.
which is over, by the Caelian Hill, is also one of those. And these are either Constantinian or quite soon after Constantine himself,
Sure.
but 4th century in any case. So, and then this one this mausoleum that Constantine's daughter, Constantina, has done for herself. I mean, she's the one paying for it. It's going to be hers. And apparently her sister was in there as well, and builds it right to kind of the back end, one of the sides of the back end of this massive circus form church. And it's round, you get kind of an idea of concentric circles. So there's an inner ring of arches, and then there's an outer ring of arches. So you get a kind of perambulatory, again, that goes all the way around. And it's got a dome. Unfortunately, the mosaics in the dome don't survive anymore. They got pulled down, and to my view, fairly gaudy Mannerist frescoes inside. Not my favorite, but the mosaics in that perambulatory, that outer ring, in that sort of basically barrel vaulted ring around, absolutely stunning. And it's vine motifs, scenes of the harvest and of country life. And in fact, because of that, in the 17th century, with scientific, I think, Descartes' old adage, de omnibus dubitandum, doubt everything. So yeah. Tradition says that it's Constantina, and tradition. Yeah, okay, fine, whatever. However, we're going to question that, and we're going to look for evidence of other things. And in fact, they came up with the idea this has to be the 17th century, that this may have been an old temple to Bacchus because of it turns out that no, in fact, it was built by Constantina. It was built to be her mausoleum. And those 4th century mosaics, themes of, you see the same kind of things down in the catacombs. Sure. I am the vine, you are the branches. This is my blood, which is broken for, this is my blood, which is shed for you. Do this in remembrance of me. That wine that you drink at communion. All of these are ancient images of fruitfulness, of abundance, of life after death. So in pre-Christian Rome, the same images mean the same things in Christian Rome, just attached to a different story, different process, different mechanism. But we see a kind of continuity. You go to the Pio-Christian part of the Vatican museums, and you see ancient Roman imperial era sarcophagi, but they're Christian, with the stories of Jesus instead, or the Acts of the Apostles instead of the stories of Apollo or Jupiter or Diana, for example. But in very, very similar aesthetics, very similar images. Then you get some things that are quite particular to Christianity. And the lamb is a perfect example. Not that we don't see that in pre-Christian iconography, but this idea that I am the good shepherd, I'll leave the 99 in the fold while I go looking for the one who's lost, and that good shepherd with a little lamb over his shoulders. This is one of the earliest Christian symbols that we have. And you'll see this in early Christian churches too, where like around the altar, you've got 6 lambs on one side, 6 lambs on the other side, and 1 lamb in the middle with a halo over his head. Yeah, well, that's the Lamb of God. So this kind of imagery repeated over and over. But there is an awful lot of crossover. And it can be confusing. But you walk into there, you really are looking at a space that is, at least this point, we know, is an undeniably Christian space, built to be a Christian space, with iconography that's very, very confusing because it is ancient and looks very similar to what you'd find even in the great necropoli decoration.
Yes, and then of course the beautiful red porphyry sarcophagus was there. It's terrible. It should still be there, in my opinion, but it's in the Vatican museums. They have literally a styrofoam copy because it looks like, because there are little pieces of it off, so it looks white underneath this like badly painted job. But the sarcophagus itself is an amazing piece. Maybe she was influenced by seeing her, well, it's her grandmother who may have ended up using one that was meant for her son Constantine, right, which is across the way. But I always think it's beautifully set up, right, by in the Greek cross room in the Vatican museums. But the thing is, by that time, you see so many incredible things, and you're like, okay, let me get on my path to the Sistine Chapel. They're often overlooked, or it's like, oh, by the way, yes, look at this, it's Constantine's daughter and Constantine's mother. But I mean,
because that was at the church of San Pietro e Marcello.
Yes.
Which
Reformed church.
Another Reformed church, exactly. And that's where Helen, Constantine's mother, was entombed. So they just, in the 18th century, take her body out, leave it in the church, and bring the box into the Vatican. Same thing with Constantina, take her body out, leave it there, and her remains are still there.
Oh, that's good.
In the mausoleum. Then they just bring the pretty box into display in that Greek cross room in the Vatican museums.
God, I can imagine what it must have been like, how heavy it was to move that thing. Or even, there's another thing that's in, just as a little sidebar, because we have to wrap this up, that there's if you look, when you enter into the complex of Saint Agnes outside the walls, and there's a big glass window to the right in the initial courtyard. Have you ever looked through that? Because you can see there's a fresco by...
when you come in from the Via Nomentana, you mean?
Bravo, yeah. Podesti, I believe, who did the Immaculate Conception room, because Pius IX was there visiting, and that the floor collapsed. I think they were eating, and the floor collapsed, and it led them into the catacombs. But it was a miracle that he had survived and others had survived, because this is also during the time of the Renaissance of archaeology. So Christian archaeologists are rediscovering for people the catacombs. Anyway, Thomas, I cannot tell you what a pleasure this was for me. You have such a gift of being able to put things into such a relatable context, I think, for me and probably for the people listening, that it's really is astounding and lovely, and makes me want to go out and look at these places with your words in mind. So what I'll do is, once we have the podcast, I'm going to listen to it myself and go to these churches and listen to you talk about these spaces.
Okay. Well, call me when you do that, and then we'll have lunch and wine, and then go look at stuff.
Oh yeah, I was thinking maybe, but I know, because you're actually a man of all trades, you're a Renaissance man doing many different jobs. You're very, very busy, as we are trying to go through. But if you want, you can join me and Mario and Dylan for lunch tomorrow while we're doing the video, if you're free.
I might be. I think I may be.
Yes, we always have copious amounts of wine, as some people like to point out. But anyway, thank you again, Thomas. It was lovely. Ciao.
Ciao.
Thank you for listening to our TE Talks with Guides. We have a new episode every Wednesday. Please subscribe to get an alert when each podcast comes out. Rate us and tell people how you enjoyed it, and share it on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Most importantly, If you enjoyed it, send us a feedback about the show. Also, if you are curious about what some of these people and places we talked about look like, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and watch the video on this podcast where we have inserted special images for you to further enjoy the story.